We hear a lot of perspectives on the Mankind podcast. Inclusion of a guest is not an endorsement of their views, and the opinions expressed here do not always represent the mission or values of the Mankind Project USA.
Looks like the rain has gone.
Hey everybody, it's Boysen Hodgson. Welcome back to the Mankind Podcast, where we are in every episode setting out to prove that there is indeed more than one way to be a man. And I think that we are doing a very fine job of that. Today, I am super excited to introduce somebody who's a new acquaintance of mine, Stefan Charidge from the UK. And Stefan and I became a little bit familiar with Stefan's work through one of his books, the Penny Method. That's not correct. It's something like that. The Penny Model. Thank you. The Penny Model a couple of years ago. And Stefan is a therapist in the UK, is a counseling supervisor. He's an international trainer and facilitator with over 23 years of experience, who's been delivering trainings on some of the things we'll be talking about today. The Penny Model. We're going to be talking about emotions. We're going to be talking a little bit about Gestalt Theory. And he is the metaphor man. So Stefan is going to bring a whole bunch of metaphors into our conversation to help us kind of deal with and understand some of these things. So Stefan, welcome. Thank you for being here. Say hello.
Oh, thank you for the invitation. My pleasure.
This is exciting. So Stefan started his training as a Gestalt counselor in the late 90s and since has attained his BACP accreditation and supervision qualification, as well as additional skills and training with other creative ways of working. He completed his MKP weekend on a cold November in 2022 at Sopley in the UK. In addition to this, he has had extensive training in shadow work. So over the years, he's blended and developed his own style and modality of working, as well as writing a book called The Penny Model, written with young men in mind, and whilst being involved with a Band of Brothers, which is another men's organization in the UK, very good organization, explaining where depression comes from. So we're going to talk about sadness and depression. That's going to be one of the things that we're going to go into today. So the Penny Model is not an academic book. It focuses on 4 core emotions of joy, fear, sadness, and anger, and their purpose and messages, and explains that whilst there is a 5th, shame, it can only be experienced while supported by one of the other 4 core emotions. So that's what we're going. So first of all, I want to just give you a little bit of time to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about your background and how you got to where you are.
Well, thanks for the introduction, because I think it just covers everything. But my trade is actually as a baker. I was a baker for 30 years and getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning and doing all those sort of bits and pieces that bakers do, and had my own business with about 30 people and such like. But I decided that I couldn't do that into my retirement years, so I decided that I needed to have a career change. And back in the late 90s, I was going through a bit of a wobble with my marriage, and saw a counsellor, and I thought, well, this is interesting, I could actually get into this, and started my training, and here I am today. So quite a shift from being a baker to a psychotherapist and trainer.
It's the magic of the right amount of things at the right temperature in the right intensity for the right amount of time.
Yeah. As per magician work, within shadow work, we say that, the masculine energy cooks by recipe, whereas the feminine energy cooks by taste. And indeed, a lot of people will bake things per recipe and say, well, it needs to go in the oven after 50 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever. But, a skilled person will actually feel it, touch it, actually be more contact with it. It's more sort of sensual as opposed to a recipe. And I feel that I have a good blend of that within my practice. And indeed, whilst doing my training as a Gestalt therapist, there are lots of words what I refer to as psychobabble, yeah, and it became very complicated. It is a very complicated modality. It's a fantastic modality,
Yes.
but the theory of it is complicated, and I like to make things as simple as possible. So, and indeed, tomorrow I have a webinar on with some people in Pakistan just on Gestalt theory. And the idea is to simplify it. Those that are familiar with Gestalt theory will be aware of the interruptions, which I'll talk about in a moment. But every one of the interruptions within a Gestalt cycle are fear based. So it's more simple just to say it's fear. Fear that gets in the way of us completing a cycle.
Nice. So there we go. Gestalt is a word that gets thrown around in men's work. I have noticed over the years. It's one of those things that someone will say, hey, what is it that you guys do? And well, it's kind of, a combination of somatic stuff and Gestalt and experiential stuff and some Jungian and it's like every single one of those things needs unpacking. But let's start with, what's Gestalt?
Well, Gestalt is a German word, and there's no actual direct translation, but it's about completion. And for me, Gestalt therapy is a creative exploration to complete unfinished business. Unfinished business, whatever that might be. And a lot of work that our listeners will have been exposed to is what I refer to as regressional work, going back into some time within our lifeline and either expelling what it was that we didn't want or receiving what it is that we did want but didn't get, which ultimately would be like a blessing. Reconnecting with our own significance and confidence. And indeed, with the 4 core emotions of being joy, fear, sadness, and anger, when I do my video presentations, I always offer a 4-armed drone to the listeners, to the attendees.
Yes.
And I say that this drone has 4 arms, and for this drone to function as we might desire, they need to be in the correct position. And the 4 arms of the drone represent the 4 core emotions of joy, fear, sadness, and anger. But the majority of people don't have enough joy in their lives. So it's as though that arm is closed in. And when we don't have enough joy in our lives, we actually start using our anger energy and become aggressive. And there's a difference between anger energy and aggression. I can talk more about that. But we don't use our anger energy constructively. We use it destructively, either towards ourself, which can be as simple as our internal dialogue, or towards others, someone or something real or imaginary, which just leaves the fear and the sadness. And the majority of people are diagnosed with anxiety, depression, and misuse their anger energy and can never really connect with their joy. So it's just a simple pattern as opposed to the complete Gestalt cycle. As I said, there are various interruptions within the Gestalt cycle, but they are all fear-based.
So give me an example of that, if you can, like real or made up of an interruption that's fear-based.
Yeah. Well, you might have the sensation of needing to go for a pee just as before you're about to go in for an interview. So the first interruption or the block would be to desensitize from the need to go for a pee. So desensitization is one of the first interruptions. And all of these interruptions to completion are trauma-based from our formative years. Everybody is traumatized in varying degrees. Everybody experiences a trauma. And a trauma could be as simple as, no, you can't have another biscuit. I liken all trauma and emotions to sugar. If I gave you a teaspoon of sugar or 50 tons of sugar, it's still sugar. A little bit or a lot. A little trauma or a big trauma. A lot of fear or a little bit of fear. But at the base is always fear. For anger, a lot of people might say to me, well, I wasn't angry, I was just niggled. Or I was annoyed. I wasn't angry, I was just frustrated. They are all anger words. So to bring about change, we need to, as human beings, name and accept what it is that's true. It's a little bit like an alcoholic. An alcoholic is not going to change until they put their hand up and say, I'm an alcoholic. To accept and acknowledge and make known what is. Otherwise, it just becomes hidden, denied, and suppressed. So there are lots of different things that actually, interrupt a Gestalt cycle. The majority of Gestalt presentations are of a circle. But metaphorically, I'd like everybody to imagine that a Gestalt cycle is a wheel. So if you imagine that you had a wheel and that wheel has one complete revolution, that's like a complete Gestalt. But our traumas, the traumas that we've experienced historically, are like, having this wheel on our bicycle going down the road, and there are like stones and bricks and lumps in the way. And as we hit those stones and bricks, sometimes it's just a bit uncomfortable, but we can continue our journeys. And sometimes the brick is so big that we have to change direction completely. We cannot complete going in the direction that we initially chose. So that could be a career path or a relationship or anything that we might want to connect with, because we are all relational beings. And connection is about sadness. We experience sadness when we don't feel connected to someone or something that we wish to be connected with. Paradoxically, when we authentically connected with others, whatever that might be, that again can evoke tears because we feel connected in the way that we want to. And not a lot of people realise, but love lives with sadness, not with joy. Because
We have to slow down. First, I'm going to go back to the piles of sugar. Trauma as sugar. So a little bit of trauma or a lot of trauma. And then this idea of one of the first interruptions might be denial, right? Like, as you said, just, no, I'm not really angry. I wasn't feeling angry. It was just it's just a little thing. It's just a little frustration, right? So how does denial function? And this might be especially pertinent in men's work, right? Because we're talking men tend to stuff it and deny and no, I didn't have trauma. It was just a little thing. It was just whatever.
Yeah. Well, that would, in Gestalt terms, that would be referred to as deflection. Yeah. We have an awareness, but we don't want to own the awareness. So we will deflect and try and minimize or reject whatever is actually true. So if there was some anger, or more predominantly, sadness, because one of the things about anger, I liken anger to being like a car. So if you had a car and the car was stationary, it can't really cause any damage. If it's doing 20 miles an hour, it can cause a bit of damage. If it's doing 100 miles an hour, it can do a lot of damage. The difference is speed. What does a car need for speed? Ultimately, fuel. A car needs fuel. Anger needs fuel. No fuel, no motion. No fuel, no acting out. The fuel of anger is too much fear, too much sadness, and jealousy. Jealousy actually lives with joy. It's the flip side of the coin. Fear is like rocket fuel. You'll get a lot of speed in a short space of time. So the fear of actually owning one's anger can actually fuel anger. I'm not angry. Leave me alone.
Yes.
Sadness is like petrol. And jealousy is a bit like something like paraffin. It works, but not very well. So some people that really kick off and are very, very aggressive can have all three fuels going in. But predominantly it is fear. So if you have a charge towards someone or something, yeah, the question to ask yourself is, what is the fuel? So for argument's sake, you might get a parking ticket. So the fuel might be the loss of the monies that you've got to pay in relation to the fine. Because we've only got a finite amount of resource. And if you're spending money on parking tickets, then you won't have enough money to spend on, well, a Mankind weekend, for example. So that's a loss.
Or a pint.
Or a pint,
Yes.
whatever the case might be. Yeah. And sadness is where depression lives. Depression, grief, love, and addictions. Addictions, love, grief, and sadness, and depression live in sadness. And as I mentioned earlier, if we use our anger energy destructively, we will feel a sense of anger or frustration, whatever you want to call it. And if we reduce anger to its basic components, all we end up with is yes or no. That is anger, energy. Yes or no.
Tell me more about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, anger energy is ultimately a choice. Yes, I'm going to go and do some meditation, and no, I'm not going to go for a pint. Or yes, I'm going to go for a pint and I'm not going to do the meditations. It's a choice. Now, neither choice is right nor wrong, but ultimately, how often might you say yes to something you want to say no to, or vice versa? So if you imagine that one hand is yes and the other hand is no, and you're crossing over your response, it's like moving your hands over and crossing your own boundaries. And every time you cross your own boundaries, it's like earning a penny. And a penny, you might think, well, it's a very small, light, insignificant coin. But the question is, how many pennies might you accumulate in a day or a week or a year? And if you put all of those pennies together, what sort of weight would there be? And if you imagine you were carrying that weight 24/7, what's going to happen to your body? Ultimately, you will become fatigued, suppressed, and eventually depressed. This is where depression comes from. Depression comes from the accumulation of these metaphorical pennies. And these metaphorical pennies manifest by saying no to something you want to say yes to, and vice versa. And if we are depressed, we have one of three main options. The first is to go and see the GP and get some medication, which I totally support, but the medication is like borrowing a wheelbarrow to move these pennies about. It does not get rid of them. And if somebody is on medication and collects yet more of these pennies, then they have to go back to the GP, medical profession, and get a bigger wheelbarrow. The other option is to turn to some form of addiction. And the definition of addiction is a repetitive behavior or action. It can be a repetitive thought pattern. We can be addicted to our own internal dialogue. And addiction is a little bit like Popeye eating spinach to gain strength. The more pennies, the more spinach is needed. And the third option is to put as many pennies as possible into a cannon and shoot that cannon at someone or something, real or imaginary. And those people that have eating disorders or self-harm, whatever that might look like, are actually shooting those pennies towards themselves to try and get rid of them. And the ultimate is suicide, which is every penny in a huge cannon and getting rid of all of them in one go. The people that actually, unfortunately, attempt suicide or do succeed with their suicide, it's not because they want to die. People do not want to die. What it is that they no longer want to experience the pain the physical sensation, the physical emotional pain of carrying the pennies, or the physical pain in their bodies from whatever sort of ailment they may be experiencing. It's that they don't want the pain. They want to say no to the pain and yes to being pain-free. That's a yes and no. That's a choice situation. But those that actually self-harm, as in cutting or burning, etc., after or bulimia, anorexia, whatever it might be, the internal dialogue is, why did I do this? I should do this and I shouldn't do that. And the whys and shouldn't words are self-beating words. It's almost like beating oneself up, metaphorically. And every time we strike ourselves with each of those words, we put another penny back in the pot. So we just get them cycled, recycled all the time. And this is how some people can't actually move on from that pattern. It's almost an addictive pattern. The only way that we can get rid of this currency is to say yes when we want to say yes and no when we want to say no. It's about that warrior energy of being clear.
There's so much richness in everything that you've been saying, and yes and no as the energetic switch inside of anger, and then how that gets manifested into an increasing burden that we carry over time. The first question that comes up is, I know that we certainly see this in the Mankind Project, and I lots of personal experience here as well. How about childhood traumas where we didn't have a choice? We weren't given the option of yes or no. It was things that happened to us. So how does that fit into this frame?
Well, while something negative or harming may have happened to you, experientially you wanted to say no, but couldn't.
Yes.
So that desire to say no is held at a cellular level in the body. And it's held and it accumulates. Ultimately, let's just say that an individual had to accept the abuse, whatever that looked like. But as they accepted the abuse or received the abuse because they didn't want it, there's going to be accumulation of no's building up in their psyche. And this is why sometimes, we experience individuals just screaming no to get it out of the system, to bring around some form of rest or completion. And that is like a Gestalt cycle. It is actually going back to see what the blocks were and what needs to change so that we can take those blocks out of the road and just continue our journey in the direction that we choose, as opposed to having to go down a different avenue because there's a big boulder in the way. Go on.
That's wonderful. And I'm going to expand the question just slightly, because for many of us, childhood trauma came at the hands of people who were supposed to be caring for us and loving us. And regardless of whether we wanted to say no to the behavior, to what was happening, to the abuse, there's also a part of us that takes on, there's a part of me that took on, but I love this person. Yeah. This person's my world. This person, Yes. Yeah. So go a little bit deeper into that.
So we've got the yes or no. Let's change that to right or wrong.
Yeah.
And when we're small, it's safer to make self wrong than make big wrong. Because we are all relational beings. We all want to relate and have healthy connection. And if we can't have healthy connection, then we'll have unhealthy connection, whatever that might look like. And there is that desire to make ourselves wrong. And this again actually adds back to the interruptions within the Gestalt cell, that sort of stuckness. And ultimately, it evokes a lot of guilt. And guilt lives with fear. because we fear others judging us as being
Yes.
weak
Yes.
or X, Y, or Z. Guilt and shame, they're like Siamese twins. Yeah. But for shame, we need to actually be told, shame on you. And it's almost as though a burden's been given to us. And we have to carry that as a mark of respect and trying to stay connected with the person that gave the message. Does that make sense?
Ooh, say more about that. Yeah, there's kind
Okay.
of a Carolyn Meese, I think, maybe, the kind of unspoken vows that we make to those
Yeah.
who hurt us.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's just say big, as opposed to mum or dad or uncle or whoever. Big, they've had their traumas and they've been conditioned as to what's okay and what's not okay. So they have their rules and beliefs. And if we have a rule and belief, I'm going to change tack a little bit. Some of listeners will believe that the world's round, and some will believe that the world's flat. Now, if you imagine for a moment I was absolutely able to convince you, take you up in a flying saucer or whatever, and prove to you that your belief was wrong, which emotion would you experience? I would imagine a lot of people, if not everybody, would feel angry. Angry towards the person that taught us what was not true. Angry towards ourselves for believing something that was not true. And even more angry for promoting something that was not true. So a belief is very, very powerful. And we as human beings, we don't like to be wrong. So we will look for evidence to support our belief system. So going back to big, having a belief that it's a shameful act to, I don't know, take a biscuit from the tin that you're not supposed to take, they will say something like, shame on you. Now, because small wants to stay in relationship with big, they will accept that judgment and they will carry it as though it's a burden into their adulthood. And every time they go and take a biscuit, they will have that sense of shame. So they would be saying yes to the judgment of shame and no to feeling okay. So again, their boundaries are crossed. But that's more of an anger type dynamic with shame. Shame is like if somebody says I have a sense of shame, I'm always interested as to which emotion is supporting it, because I liken shame to being like a spinning plate at a circus act. The plate cannot spin unless it's supported by a stick. Shame cannot be experienced unless it's supported by an emotion. So somebody might smash a window in temper and then slip into their shame because they've acted out. Somebody might scream because they've seen a spider and slip into their shame because they've acted out. Men might let go of some of their tears and then slip into their shame because they've acted out. The message, the introject, the belief is big boys don't cry. And that's why a lot of men will desensitize and swallow their tears. Yeah. And for joy is where confidence and self-esteem lives, as well as feeling relaxed, at ease, peaceful and calm. If you feel peaceful and calm, you're in your joy. It's not about having a fun time, although everybody wants to have a fun time. It's about being relaxed, peaceful and calm. And as I said earlier, jealousy is the flip side of the coin for joy. So if somebody's confidence is very low, you'll see this where people buy raffle tickets to win the big cuddly toy. And when their number's called out, get excited and then turn around and say, I can't go up, you go up for me. Because there's a fear of how others might judge them, and they would have a sense of shame because there could be some jealousy from others attending that you won and they didn't win. So to avoid that, it's actually a deflection, which is another part of the Gestalt cycle. And also there's a part of projection. They're projecting some of their past onto the audience and fearing with their projection that others are going to judge them. Judgments live with fear.
Ooh, okay. So it just keeps getting rich. It just keeps adding to the riches here. I want to go back to the bicycle. One of the things that you were saying, as you know, being on the road and the things that interrupt us, the interruptions that happen. The other thing that I'm imagining as a cyclist with a brick in the road is that the brick is also going to have a physical impact on the bike that I'm riding, right? So then my tire is going to end up, my wheel is going to end up with a dent, so that now every rotation.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So some people with Gestalt cycles, they look at it as a wave. Yeah, that a wave builds up and it crashes over and it's complete. So that's a cycle. I look at it as a body of water, because in a body of water there are multiple waves. Some are going to be very long and some are going to be very short. And as we go through life, there are millions of waves that we experience. And the damage to the bike is a great analogy, because every cell in our body is pretty much every cell is replaced every 30 days. And if you imagine that each cell is like a ping pong ball, I'm sure you'll remember when you college or whatever, playing ping pong, every now and again the ping pong ball would be dented.
Yes.
So when we experience a trauma, it's almost as though a ping pong ball has been dented. And when that cell is replaced, and we get older every 30 days, the cell is replaced like for like. So if it's damaged and replaced, it's replaced damaged. There are several books on this, but as I say, I think it's very complicated.
Yes.
Talk about the different chemicals and everything else. But ultimately, if you imagine that we're just a multitude of, I think it's 3 trillion or 30 trillion cells. Now, so doing therapy, doing a men's weekend, doing meditation, yoga, whatever, that is metaphorically massaging the ping pong ball. And if you massage a ping pong ball, you can actually massage the dent out, so it's round and complete again. So the more we do for ourselves, as in personal work, whatever that might look like, and it might be a walk in the forest, it doesn't have to be anything in particular, it's actually repairing some of those damaged cells, those traumas. But even if we make the ping pong ball or the cells round, you will always see a little bit of a scar on it. And that part of the ping pong ball will be more susceptible to being dented again. So that's like the old trauma. And this is why we can be re-traumatized, re-triggered very, very easily, because the field conditions are similar. And that relates to projection and judgments. Everybody fears being judged. And if we fear being judged, the first thing to do is to bring to mind a judge saying, you are guilty of. And remember, we said at the beginning about alcoholics having to name and own, I'm an alcoholic. We need to actually name the judgment. Once the judgment is named, we can interact with it. If we just say, oh, I feel guilt and I feel it in my body, we can relate to that. But we need to have the judgment and the judge. If we have the judge and the judgment, we can interact with it. 90% of the work is anger work to destroy the judgment and the judge, metaphorically. And about 10% of it is actually sadness and grief work, to actually explore, what was missing in Small's life as opposed to what Small got. So that's yeses and nos. Yes, he got the abuse or the judgments, and no, he didn't get the hugs and acceptance. So, but predominantly, 80, 90% of this anger work, but some of it flips to grief work as well, and lover energy.
I just reflect back that when you said that 90% of it is anger work and dealing with the judge and the judgment, there was some reaction in me that was like, oh no, but I don't want to be angry like that. But then I'm going to reframe. It's like, it's just anger work is about yeses and no's.
And no's. Exactly
So,
that. It
yeah,
doesn't
so it's,
have to be aggressive.
so doesn't have to be aggressive. So draw those things apart a little bit. Talk about aggression.
Well, aggression, I liken it to gunpowder. Yeah. So we can become explosive. And a lot of anger management programs, well, I liken it to everybody's got like a powder keg in their psyche. And every time we get a no when we want a yes, or vice versa, we get a yes to a smack and a no to the hug. Yeah, it's like gunpowder being put into the powder keg. And when we're small, the terrible twos, for example,
Yeah.
that powder keg is exposed and we can become very sort of angry. But whilst we get angry at 2 and 3-year-olds, there are always repercussions, especially for the females. So there are consequences of being angry, and that anger is squashed. So whilst that anger is squashed, we are conditioned to put a lid on the gunpowder keg. But as soon as we put a lid on it to stop the spark getting in and there being a big explosion, another powder keg manifests. And so it builds up. So this is a little bit like the aggressive anger building up as a metaphorical weight, as well as the depressive pennies building up as a metaphorical weight. So you could have both weights building up. So the beautiful thing with regards to the MKP weekends is it gives people an opportunity to burn off some of this gunpowder, but in a safe environment.
Mm-hmm.
Because the consequences are minimalized or just got away with, really. And the work is to and I can offer a little experiment here and now. Yeah. So my invitation is for everybody to bring to mind something that you've got some anger towards, whether it's the government, next door neighbour, COVID. Excuse me. So close your eyes and breathe into your body and just allow yourself to acknowledge the anger, whether it's big or small, but just acknowledge the anger. Breathe into your body, acknowledge where it lives in your body, and give it a bit of a shape and size. Give it a texture. And as you breathe into your body, give it a colour. And as you breathe into your body, really acknowledging this anger in your body, give it a score. Anything from 1 to 10, 10 being maximum. Give it a score. And now, in your mind's eye, what I'd like you to do is to imagine that you could take a balloon. Take a balloon of the colour that represents your anger. In your mind's eye, take a balloon, take a couple of nice deep breaths. And in a moment, my invitation is going to be for you to blow that balloon up as hard and as fast as you possibly can. So do that now. Take a deep breath and blow it up. Yeah. And once this balloon is blown up, tie it off. And then ask yourself, what do you want to have happen to this balloon? What do you want to have happen to it? And what might you want to say to this balloon? What might you want to say to the anger? What might your anger want to have happen? And my invitation is for you to give yourself permission to take whatever action you want towards this balloon. You might want to pop it. And if you do want to pop it, how? Do you want to stamp on it? Do you want to squeeze it? Do you want to bite it? Do you want to let it down? Do you want it to float away? So my invitation is for you to give yourself permission to speak whatever needs to be spoken and then take whatever action, and in your mind's eye just imagine that it's happening. So do that now. And with it done, take your attention and your breath back into your body to where that anger was and give it a score now. what score might you give it? So that's just a basic process, because our bodies cannot tell the difference between reality and fantasy. Can't. If we imagine it, if we visualize it, if we allow our bodies to connect with, can't tell the difference. And I would imagine that the listeners, that the majority, if not everybody, your anger will have gone down. I don't know by how much. It might have gone down by 1. I've done this on webinars, and some people say it's gone down by 8 or 7. And the more energy that is put into the breathing, the more can take place. And there are other tools and resources that can be used to actually burn off some of this explosive gunpowder in a safe way without any true life consequences.
So that ultimately I can get to a place of stasis where my yeses and nos are coming from clear and conscious actions, choices,
Yeah.
rather than driven by old bumps in my rims and imaginations about bricks in the road and the number of pennies that are in my wheelbarrow.
Exactly that. And a healthy yes or no is only healthy in the moment. For example, people can actually earn a penny by saying yes to a cup of tea when somebody offers them a cup of tea, but inside they'd rather have a cup of coffee. But not wanting to reject the person's offer or have the person judge them as being awkward, fussy, or a bit of a nuisance, to avoid all those possibilities of being judged, it's easier to say yes to the tea. But that's an unhealthy yes, and that's another penny. The work is to say a healthy no to the tea and a healthy yes to the coffee, which would probably sound more like, I'd rather have a coffee, or is coffee available? And then for the person that's offering, for them to say their yes or no. And you might get a no because, or no, there is no coffee. And if there is no coffee, well, then you can say a healthy yes to the tea, because you haven't denied yourself what it is that you wanted in the first place. And coming back to the bicycle analogy, it's taken the route that you wanted to take initially without having to do all the deviations or diversions to avoid the bumps and lumps. So, in the morning you might want a coffee, in the afternoon you might want a squash, in the evening you might want a tea. It's only healthy in the moment.
It occurs to me that we are relational beings, as you said very early on. And it occurs to me that one of the pieces in here about establishing healthy relationships and kind of growing ourselves out of these patterns is like the coffee and tea analogy that you just used. That's really beautiful. If both of us in the exchange have an understanding of a shared reality in which it's healthy.
Yeah.
No, thank you to the tea. Do you have coffee available? No, I don't have coffee available. I only have tea. Okay, very good. Then I'll take tea. Or, no, thank you. I'm good.
Yeah.
And if both of us are understanding without a heightened sense of sensitivity about it, or when someone says no to me, I feel bad immediately, or like all of these kind of things, right? It's a relational skill.
Yeah. And indeed, within relationships, we all want to make meaning and understanding. And this goes back to small being traumatized by big. Yeah. And when small is traumatized by big, which can, quite often I refer to small wanting a hug. Yeah. And big's not available because big might be under the influence of something. Big may have died. Big may have left the family unit. Big may be at work. Small might be sent off to boarding school, which is classed as a benefit, yeah. But the majority of people that went to boarding school are actually really traumatized, because they don't want a hug from the nurse or whoever. They want a hug from mum or dad, irrespective of whether or not they've ever met mum or dad.
Right.
And indeed, if you imagine that mum or dad has died when the person's born and they find out that they've died, as soon as they find out that they've died, because we want to make meaning and understanding, we will search for, well, what was wrong with me? Why did they leave me? Why was I abandoned? There's all these whys. And as I said earlier on, the why word is an aggressive word. Every time you ask somebody the why word or yourself the why word, the subliminal message is you're wrong. It's a little bit like asking somebody, why did you close that door? It implies they had a choice to leave the door open or to close it. And they made the wrong choice, else the question wouldn't be asked. So why am I feeling like this? You're actually beating yourself up by asking why you're feeling like it. And that's going to...
So what's the alternative in there? Because this is something that in the Mankind Project and in our men's groups, this is one of our very early, we're going to teach you how to facilitate, stop asking why.
Yeah, never ask why.
Because you'll immediately throw a man back into his shame, into his guilt, into his head, into his questions, like all that. Yeah.
Because
what's the alternative?
So you did this because you leave it open. So the because word, when, where, how, and what. So when did this happen? How did it happen? What did you want? Whilst you got X, what is it you wanted? I wanted Y. So it's inviting the person to speak their truth and share more of their intimacy. And the word intimacy broken down is into me see. And there's a vulnerability because, there's a part of me, well, if I was to really expose all of my shit and my belief systems, I would be rejected.
Mm-hmm.
The ultimate fear is rejection. Whereas because we're relational beings, to be ostracized and rejected. So to avoid rejection, and we need to be judged to be rejected, judged as guilty. Yeah. To avoid that, we are more closed down, and it becomes more hidden, suppressed, and depressed.
Right. How do we move from? So we're very down. We've got a broken down bicycle. We're dragging I've got a wheelbarrow in front of me and I'm dragging a red wagon full of pennies and I'm still in pain. So this is something that I see out there a lot in the kind of men's group forums and online forums that are anonymous and men just hurting, just suffering. So what are some things? What do I do now? I'm suffering.
Yeah. Well, the first thing is to name it, to name and own. I'm in pain. I'm suffering. We don't need to know what the cause is, what the history is. And indeed, when, with trauma, we're all traumatized, as I said. And just imagine that somebody is raped, which would be a massive trauma. When I work with people with such traumas, I never ask them about what's happened.
Yes.
Never.
Yes.
I only ever, and I focus on, so whilst this has happened, how might you be judging yourself? The judgment is like glue to trauma. Might be judging themselves as stupid or, weak, pathetic. That all those judgments, we need to actually get the solvent for the judgment, because the judgment are like glue to the trauma. People can't move on from trauma if they're still judging themselves. We need to actually engage with the judgment. And indeed, people in grief, living with sadness, grief and anger are like a seesaw. And if somebody's grief is up, then we need to explore how they're using that anger energy and to engage with that anger. Now, a lot of people get stuck with this in the sense of, well, how can I be angry with my mum? Because I love my mum. But there will always be anger there. Anger that you didn't spend enough time with mum, anger because you didn't tell mum that you loved her enough, anger because mum smoked and she died of cancer, anger towards COVID, anger towards the medical. I don't know what the anger is going to be towards, but that anger needs to be named and owned and worked with. And the flip side is if somebody's really, really angry, and this will have been illustrated in the film The Work,
Yes.
their anger's right up and their sadness is right down on the seesaw. So it's
Right.
actually, most very angry, aggressive people are in their grief, but they don't know it and they can't accept it and they can't name it. Because if they, let's just say, belong to a gang and they said, look, I really miss my dad and I never
Yeah.
had any hugs from him, what would happen? They would no longer, they would be rejected. So to avoid the rejection from the gang, they maintain, the stance of being the rebellious teenager or whoever or whatever, the aggressive person. So if somebody's very aggressive, it's explore their sadness. If somebody's very sad, it's explore their anger. Fear and joy also live on a seesaw.
Mm.
And if somebody's fear is right up, their joy is right down. But it's very, very difficult to push joy up. You can't do it. It can't be done. We need to bring fear down. And by bringing fear down, people are more able to use that anger energy constructively instead of destructively. If fear comes down, they're able to say more yeses and nos. And if they're able to say more healthy yeses and nos, then they will connect more to what they want to connect with, which is their sadness. Yeah. And sadness is where love lives. So by overcoming the fear, using our anger energy constructively, we can feel connected to whatever it is, even if it's to polar bears. If that's what somebody really wants to do, it's about, yes, going off to wherever polar bears live to connect with them. And then you feel connected, and then joy is secondary to sadness, and then you can have joy because you feel connected to what it is that you want to connect with. And that's a little bit like a Gestalt cycle, going from joy to fear to anger to sadness back to joy. It's far simpler than desensitization, projection, introjections, deflections, egotism, and all the rest of it that goes with it.
Beautiful. How do you define love?
That's a really good question. Really good question. I think the definition of love is whatever actually fuels a sense of contentment and relaxation. It's actually something that comes before. So that could be the love of the sunshine sitting in the garden, or the love of a person sat with them, watching a film, or I don't know, playing cards, whatever it might be, having a walk in the park with them. It's actually whatever we're doing, whatever we're connecting with, manifests and evokes a sense of relaxation, peacefulness, and calmness.
Which you define kind of in the joy spectrum, that
In
joy
the joy
is
spectrum,
that sense.
Yeah.
And this is helping me a lot. So, and then you said on the other side, the flip side of the coin from joy is jealousy.
Jealousy.
So, so in the shadow work realm, right? So the shadow aspect of love, or the shadow aspect of joy, is that jealousy.
Jealousy, yeah.
And I can fool myself into thinking that my jealousy is love. On some level, it's like that unhealthy attachment kind of covetousness rather than.
Yeah, you could actually say that jealousy is a motivator. Yeah, but it's almost like an imposter. I used to class it as ducks, when you see a duck on the water, you think, oh, it looks very pleasant and calm, etc. But underneath, his feet are going 10 to the dozen. Yeah, you can't actually see what's going on underneath. And jealousy, there's no flow to it. There's no flow to it. You could argue that it's a motivator, i.e., next door neighbour's got a super duper car. And it's like, well, I want that car as well, so I have to go out and get work and so on and so forth. But if it doesn't come easy, if it doesn't come easy, it's like trying to force love. It can't happen. It's almost like a force.
Wonderful. Last two questions, and they're related. So Out there in the world, I want to end on hope. I want to end in hope.
Mm.
What's something that you see being embodied by men out there that you really love and want to see more of?
Mobilizing to a realistic and achievable stretch. I mean, we are actually. I mean, this, it's a bit of a stretch for me, um, but it's taking the risk. It's feeling the fear and doing it anyway. And we are, as men, we are risk takers, risking sharing our intimacy, risking sharing our vulnerability. And only when people actually share their intimacy, as I said, intimacy, my authentic emotions, my authentic cup of tea or coffee, yeah, speaking one's truth and using one's anger energy constructively. I think that this sort of work and doing the stretch is what I like, and what I love really seeing men do it. And I've experienced it, and I've experienced being held whilst doing it. And up until
Yes.
my MKP, I'd never experienced it. I was hugely fear based of all men, hugely.
Thank you. Thank you. And how about what is something that you see being embodied out there in the culture by women that you love and want to see more of?
Well, the nurturing. They Women I experience as nurturers, and paradoxically, the more vulnerability that is shared within the female community or with women, more connection there is, because women just want to nurture. Men want to expand and be bigger, etc. And women, the feminine energy, want to nurture and look after and nourish. And I don't know whether or not it exists or whether it's a different name. But I've attended my Noble Man one. I don't know if you're familiar with that Celebration
I'm
of
not.
Being. It's called Celebration of Being, and that was just an amazing weekend. It really was an amazing weekend. So men attended as initiates, women staffed, just women
Mm,
staffed in processes. There were some men there to hold a container, but oh, life changing, life changing. And that comes from the nurturing energy of the feminine.
thank you. Thank you. Stefan Charidge, thank you for being here. How can folks get in touch with you and learn more about your work?
Well, anybody can email me, and that's Charidge, CHARIDGE @gmail.com. And if people are interested in having or attending a webinar specifically focused on one topic or another, so there's like 2 hours just on guilt and shame and processes, and the majority of my webinars are not recorded because there's always an
Mm,
invitation for somebody to do a piece of work.
mm,
And sometimes one person will volunteer or another, or sometimes nobody volunteers, and I talk everybody through a little bit like the balloon exercise, a process, but obviously you make notes for yourself as you go through. A lot of work can take place on a personal basis, and also to add to your toolkit to facilitate others.
wonderful. So look in the show notes for links to Stefan's website, and I'll throw his email address in there so that you can get in touch. Stefan, this has been enlightening and a comfort, I think.
Right.
In my body, that's how I'm experiencing this
hmm hmm
conversation as,
hmm
yeah, as comforting. So thank you for that.
Oh, well, thank you for the invite. And um, I know I speed up, but that's my fear, that's my anxiety coming in. Because I'm worried about how I might be judged. Let's own it. as as not getting it all across. So I speed up
Yeah.
to try and squeeze as much as possible in. And my learning curve, my stretch for myself is to slow down.
Thank you. May it be so for you and for all of us who throw ourselves into that fear and anxiety part of our beings. Yay. Thank you.
No worries. Okay. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
This has been the Mankind Podcast, produced in association with the Mankind Project USA. And I personally want to thank our guests for joining us today and imparting their wisdom from their experiences in this amazing journey called life. Now, the fee for this episode is simple. If you found gold and insights that you believe could benefit your loved ones and those you care about, be sure to share it with them. And of course, remember that life doesn't happen to us. It happens for us, so long as we rip the pen out of fate's hand and become the author of our own story. So my friend, pick up the pen and we'll see you next week. Lots of love.